It's hard to believe today, but when Vladimir Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he was confident Kiev would fall in no time. 8 years previously, Moscow's forces had seized Crimea in a nearly bloodless takeover. 6 years before that, in 2008, the Russian army had defeated Georgia after only 5 days of fighting. And now, here, that same army was racing towards Kiev, intending to decapitate the Ukrainian leadership in a lightning-fast strike, one in which it's safe to assume Putin anticipated a low number of Russian casualties, something in the hundreds, maybe only in the dozens. Had the autocrat been able to see the true figure, you have to wonder if it'd have gone ahead. Because today, 18 months later, no one seriously thinks Russia's losses in Ukraine have been anything but catastrophic. While totals vary, all reputable sources believe that at a bare minimum, tens of thousands of Russians have died. That's a staggering number, but it's also one that raises an important question. How are these death tolls calculated, and how can ordinary people far from the conflict know which totals are accurate? Well, in today's somewhat geeky episode, we're going to dig down on the data on Russian deaths and try and catch a glimpse of the true suffering behind the headlines. Now, when adding up the dead of any war, it's tempting to assume getting the true figure must be pretty easy. After all, even the most incompetent military can tell when soldiers it sent into battle don't come back. But of course, real life is never simple, and while we've no doubt both Russia and Ukraine have accurate casualty figures, there's little to no chance that either side is going to share them. Partly this is for obvious reasons. When fighting a war, you need to keep morale high, and nothing punctures morale quicker than some general going, "The village we recaptured? Yeah, lost about 10,000 men doing so. Now, who wants to volunteer for the next mission?" Sometimes it's also because documenting losses can be a technical challenge. In the Ukraine war, for example, Kiev lists about 23,000 of its own soldiers as not dead, but missing. Now, some of those men are doubtless alive and being kept prisoner by Russian or Wagner forces. Others presumably fled the battlefield and are now in hiding. But many of them were probably killed in circumstances that make confirming their deaths impossible. When a missile collapsed a building they were in, say, or when a detachment was surrounded in Bakhmut and killed out of sight of their comrades. Still, for all the reasonable excuses to not publish war deaths, one unreasonable one looms above all others. In many cases, commanders simply don't want to. This is especially true on the Russian side. While Ukraine also doesn't publish its own casualty figures, the Kremlin has gone further in trying to stop ordinary people from leaking them. For example, independent Russian outlet Medusa reports that information on the country's war deaths has been classified. So strict are the criteria that some citizens have even been prosecuted for posting tributes to their dead relatives on social media. Now, to be fair, this ban has been enforced haphazardly. Not everyone mourning on Telegram gets a knock on the door, or even the majority of them. Still, it has created a chilling effect which makes it hard to gauge just how many young Russians have vanished into the Ukraine meat grinder. An effect that is likely intentional. We can tell this by looking at another context where Russians publicly mourn war dead. Every May, millions of people take part in the Immortal Regiment, marching through cities holding photos of relatives who fought in World War II. This year, it was cancelled by the Russian authorities. Although security concerns were cited, many Western analysts believed it was due to worries that relatives of those killed in Ukraine would march with photos, thereby illustrating the true death toll. And that true part there is important because Moscow has its own official death toll. Back in September 2022, the Defense Ministry announced that 5,937 Russian troops had been killed in over 6 months of fighting. Even then, this was thought to be an absurd undercount. Today, after the horrors of Bakhmut and the failed Russian winter offensive, it's likely this is a mere fraction of the true total. Yet the number has not been updated, and likely with good reason. For all Putin likes to frame his unprovoked attack on Ukraine as a defensive war, only the most brainwashed propaganda addict believes Russia is fighting an existential conflict. Let the real numbers out, and the regime likely fears the public are going to revolt. Still, there are clues out there, clues that point to the true toll of 18 months of high-intensity combat. And all of them point towards an ongoing slaughter. Since the Kremlin refuses to release casualty figures, there are two other sources we can look at for ballpark figures. Things said by Russia's opponents and things accidentally let slip by Russia's own commanders. So let's start with the opponent, specifically the biggest opponent of all, Ukraine. Every day, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense publishes an update where it lists a running total of Russian casualties and equipment losses. On the day that this was written, that's August the 9th, it stood at 251,620. That's more people than live in Richmond, Virginia. Of course, this figure comes with two problems. One, rather than just deaths, it lists casualties, which means every soldier taken off the board, whether by dying, being wounded, being captured, or going missing. The second problem is that there's a clear reason for Kiev to inflate this number, to try and demoralize the Russian side so they give up fighting. For that reason, any numbers supplied by the Ukrainians need to be taken not just with a pinch of salt, but with a bucket full of Sarlo. An attitude that should apply to similar claims, such as those that Kiev has tens of thousands of Russian bodies awaiting repatriation. More trustworthy might be the count supplied by Ukraine's Western allies. This is especially true when those allies have access to good Russian intelligence, like the US and the UK, two of the only countries that accurately called the invasion before it happened. In early August, the New York Times reported that the Pentagon now estimates 200,000 have died in the war, with casualties, quote, roughly split between the two sides. If correct, that would mean a vast increase in the number of deaths across 2023. Back when the Pentagon leaks came to light in the spring, American intelligence was claiming in secret briefings that between 35,500 and 43,000 Russians have been killed. That somewhat chimed with a similar assessment the UK's MOD offered in February of between 40 and 60,000 dead. An increase to around 100,000 could be consistent with how the war has gone this year. Back on May the 1st, National Security Council spokesman John Kirby claimed that 20,000 Russian fighters have been killed in the previous 5 months, with half of them dying around the ruined city of Bakhmut. Nonetheless, for all their intelligence-gathering abilities, the Pentagon and the UK MOD are mostly working through signals interception and statistical analysis. While it's possible they have a high-level mole handing them the true death counts, it's also possible that their numbers are inflated or otherwise distorted. Now, to get a more accurate count, we have to turn to perhaps the strangest source of all, Russia's own commanders. While Russia's official figures are about as trustworthy as a guy selling you a used car that he claims was once owned by James Bond, the unofficial figures are a different story. By which we mean the figures the Kremlin didn't want released but slipped out anyway. In some cases, these slips have been deliberate. The mutinous Wagner Group, for example, clearly feels comfortable ignoring the presidential decree classifying casualty lists. On the 20th of July, the Wagner loading Telegram channel, which is said to be connected to Yevgeny Prigozhin himself, published a detailed overview of the capture of Bakhmut. In it, the channel broke down everything from the total number of Wagner fighters involved, 78,000, to how many were former prisoners, 49,000. More importantly, for our video today, they included the following sentence. At the time of the capture of Bakhmut, the 20th of May, 22,000 fighters were killed, 40,000 wounded. Remember, that's just among Wagner forces involved in a single battle. If they lost that many taking one city, it's hard to believe the rest of the Russian military has seen under 6,000 deaths, isn't it? Still, Wagner's publication of its figures was a rare event. More frequently, such statistics have slipped out accidentally. The Pentagon leaks claim to include intercepted data from the FSB, Russia's notorious security service. According to the files, the FSB in early 2023 counted nearly 110,000 casualties spread between the regular Russian military, Roskadia, and the Wagner Group. Again, that's casualties, not deaths, but it's still a jaw-dropping number, one likely reflected in reported deaths among elite soldiers. In August, the commander of the elite Russian airborne forces, Mikhail Teplinsky, released a video intended to celebrate his men's dedication and sacrifice. In it, he boasted how 5,000 wounded paratroopers had returned to the front line after treatment, while another 3,500 were wounded but refused to stop fighting. Unfortunately for Teplinsky, people quickly realized you could use his figures to estimate a crude death toll for the most elite of Moscow's forces. The death toll that open-source intelligence analyst Kirill Mikhalkov told independent media appeared to run into the several thousands. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Teplinsky's video was deleted shortly after. As with the figures from Kiev, Washington, and London, none of these slips or totals gives us a cast-iron guarantee that we know Russia's true death toll. But they do offer us a loose figure by which to judge those deaths against other wars. The bad news for Putin is that they don't stack up well at all. In the 5-day Russo-Georgian War, for example, a mere 64 Russian servicemen were killed. As analyst Michael Kaufman has noted, to quote, "Of those, potentially as many as 40% resulted from road accidents on the way to the fight." Far deadlier were the 2 Chechen wars, which the military maintains killed about 10,000 people. Deadlier still was the Soviet-Afghan War, in which 15,000 soldiers for the USSR died. However, both those totals are still lower than the Wagner Group's reported death toll around Bakhmut, meaning the Ukraine war has been spectacularly bloody for Russia, however you look at it. But we're still just dealing with generalities at this stage. Extrapolations based on estimates, intercepts, and accidental releases. No. If we want to get a truly accurate count of combat deaths, we're going to have to dig deeper to try and figure out a way of including only 100% confirmed kills. Now, thankfully, 2 organizations have spent the war doing exactly that. Data goldmine. Now, if you spend your time on certain corners of British social media, you'll know it's supremely fashionable to bash the BBC, to lambast the corporation as woke or biased or hopelessly pro-Tory or, well, whatever your particular bugbear is. But then they'll go and do something like the joint investigation their Russian language service undertook alongside independent outlet Mediazona. An investigation that proves, for all their faults, the Beeb still do some of the best hands-on reporting on the planet. An investigation to individually document every single Ukraine war death that they possibly can. That this is an incredibly tricky undertaking probably shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. To confirm a death, the BBC and Mediazona rely on a stringent set of criteria. Photographs of bodies, even with accompanying documents, are rejected because they can't be easily verified. Likewise, claims by the Ukrainian authorities aren't enough alone. Instead, the reporters require either an official statement from the Russian military or statements backed up with photos sourced from the dead man's local area. This could be morning posts from friends and relatives on social media. It could be obituaries published in a local paper. The point is, the dead person's existence and death must be verifiable, and the information about them rock solid. In many cases, this includes volunteers traveling to the cemeteries where the dead are buried to photograph their gravestones. In others, it has involved monitoring war memorials in small towns for new names being added. Backed up by a massive dataset that were made public once it's safe to do so, the BBC/Mediazona account is currently considered to be the best available. If someone's name is on that list, you can guarantee they were a real person and really died fighting in Ukraine. As for the reasons why the 2 organizations are doing this, well, we'll let the BBC explain. To quote, "The count began because BBC Russian staff knew that otherwise there might never be a trustworthy record of fatalities. Each side in a war downplays its losses, but Russia has a history of obscuring its wartime deaths far beyond what is necessary for military secrecy or the nation's morale. Years after the Afghan and Chechen wars ended, veterans and relatives are still struggling to get accurate public records of the dead." End quote. As the statement later points out, accurate counts aren't just important for observers and analysts. Having confirmation that a relative has been killed can allow family members to access benefits and get closure that the Russian state otherwise denies them. Still, we want to be careful here, not to overplay the BBC/Mediazona project too much. Because while it's a work of extraordinary and ongoing journalism, it also suffers from limitations, as the organizations themselves do acknowledge. For one thing, the count excludes all those who are fighting for the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. That is, the separatists in eastern Ukraine, who are on Russia's side. For another, it also misses many deaths where no publicly available information exists. As such, it represents not a total, but a bare minimum number of deaths suffered by Russian forces. Because it updates monthly, that bare minimum at the time of recording last dated back to the 28th of July 2023. At that point, Moscow's forces had suffered a confirmed 28,652 deaths. Again, you'll notice that it is nearly twice as high as the total number of deaths that the USSR suffered in Afghanistan over a much longer time frame. Unlike in that war, though, the dead aren't just military professionals. The data breaks down those killed by rank and function, so we can see, for example, that over 2,300 Russian officers have died in Ukraine, with 280 being ranked lieutenant colonel or higher. Likewise, we can see that at least 174 military pilots have been killed. As Mediazona notes, this is a major loss since training a single pilot can cost over $3 million American dollars. More fascinating still is learning what percentage of these dead men served in what kind of units. While the highest percentage, 23.5% of those killed, played an unknown role, many more can be easily categorized. That means we can see that the highest death toll has been among prisoners recruited by Wagner, accounting for 18.6% of all deaths. After that, the worst hit are mobilized personnel and then volunteers. Among professional soldiers, meanwhile, the motorized rifle forces have fared worst. Such granular data has allowed the BBC to track how the profile of those killed has changed over the war. In a recent article, they illustrated how the average Russian casualty in the first 3 months of the conflict was a 21-year-old professional soldier. By mid-2023, it was a 34-year-old ex-prisoner. Still, this method, as impressive as it is, isn't the only accurate way to measure the numbers dying. As we learned during COVID, there are all sorts of complex analyses that statisticians can use to determine excess deaths during a disaster. And what works in a pandemic can also work in a war. Independent Russian outlet Mediazona has had a very busy war. Aside from its collaboration with the BBC and, the challenge of reporting on an authoritarian regime conducting a genocidal war, it's also been pursuing another major investigation. Working alongside the similarly independent Medusa and in collaboration with statistician Dmitry Kobak at Tübingen University, they've been using advanced analysis to go beyond the BBC count to capture the invisible dead that the investigation missed. To do this, they use tools designed to help estimate excess deaths during a pandemic or natural disaster. Tools that were extremely useful just a couple of years ago as Russia routinely obfuscated its COVID death toll. On July the 10th, 2023, they finally published the results of their joint study. Results which quickly caught the global media's attention and which we're going to just quote here. We estimate that between 40 and 55,000 Russian men under the age of 50 died fighting in Ukraine by May the 27th, 2023. The quote ends. Assuming the correct number is somewhere in the middle, that gives a death toll of 47,000. As Medusa pointed out, that would mean, quote, 3 times more Russian soldiers died in Ukraine than Soviet troops over 10 years of war in Afghanistan, and 9 times more soldiers were killed in Ukraine than in the first Russian-Chechen war between 1994 and 1996. The quote ends. Think about that for a second. In an American context, that's almost level with the total number of combat deaths in the Vietnam War, if you exclude the 9,000 or so who died in accidents. And that's a war that lasted for many years. The Ukraine War has yet to breach the 2-year mark. There's simply no other war this side of World War II that has been so deadly for Russia, either as an independent state or as part of the Soviet Union. Of course, to agree with that conclusion, you need to trust the Medusa study. So rather than comparing this toll to all the various wars Russia has been involved in, we'll instead try now to explain how they reached the 47,000 number. As they explain on their website, Medusa's first step was to gain access to a vast, restricted database of inheritance cases known as the probate registry. This registry is useful because under Russian law, you have 6 months to claim inheritance from a dead relative, otherwise you have to fight for it in the courts. This means relations of dead soldiers are incentivized to log their claims in a timely manner. Also useful is the registry's sheer size. Per Medusa, the records we received include more than 11 million individual cases since 2014. That's a large enough sample to get a non-random representative outcome, one that's arrived at via a relatively straightforward method. Unlike on the Ukrainian side, almost no women are fighting for Russia. The BBC investigation in the last chapter has turned up just 4 confirmed female deaths among Moscow's forces. That means the Medusa team can look at inheritance cases among certain age groups and see when claims spiked among both genders or among males only. If both genders spiked, that would suggest another cause, like the lingering effects of the pandemic. If, however, the spike was only among men, that would suggest something was killing young men but leaving young women untouched. Something like a gigantic war. You can see how this works just by looking at inheritance claims on the property of 20 to 24-year-olds during the first week of the war. To quote, in the first week of the invasion, the average number of cases opened for men skyrocketed to 117, 4 times higher than before, while it remained a steady 16 for women. Obviously, the overall model is more complicated than we've made it sound. We're not statisticians after all. If you want to get into the nitty-gritty, Medusa have a full explanation on their website. Hopefully, though, we've at least given you a flavour of how this figure was reached and why it might be close to the true toll. As the journalists themselves write, there is a significant wartime spike in mortality among men that we interpret to be the result of battlefield losses. While indirect factors like rising violent crime or suicide could have caused some fraction of these cases, long-term trends suggest that the war is overwhelmingly to blame. Quote ends. Not that the impact of the war is being felt equally across Russia. And that means it's time to embark on our final section for today, the part where we examine the regions where most of these dead young men are being buried. And depressing major spoiler alert, it's not St. Petersburg or Moscow. One thing that has puzzled some Western observers of Russia is how little effect the war's toll seems to be having on the Putin regime. After all, the deaths of 15,000 servicemen in Afghanistan across a decade shook the Soviet Union. The impact of the Vietnam War reverberated across American culture and society for years. Yet, when reporters venture to modern-day Moscow or St. Petersburg, they see nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to suggest these cities sit at the heart of a nation losing tens of thousands in a brutal and unnecessary war. Obviously, with this being Russia, it is hard to know what people's opinions really are. As we saw in the Wagner Mutiny, when very few Rosguardia units tried to stop their advance, it's possible discontent is bubbling away just below the surface. Equally though, it's possible that the untroubled-seeming residents that visitors see sitting in Moscow cafes are really untroubled, and with good reason. As the figures show, those dying in Ukraine are rarely from Russia's wealthier cities, rather they're disproportionately drawn from poorer regions and ethnic minorities. The BBC/Mediazona study lists the full recorded death toll from each region. According to their figures, last updated on the 30th of July, so far 273 men from St. Petersburg have been killed, alongside 229 from the Moscow region. Now compare that to the ethnically Asian Republic of Buryatia. Despite having a population of less than a tenth of Moscow, Buryatia has seen 856 of its young men die in Ukraine. Chelyabinsk has lost 890, Kuban has lost over 1,000. The New York Times helpfully broke down some of these differences on a death per capita basis. To quote, "For every Moscovite who dies in the war, 87.5 people die in Dagestan, Russia's southernmost republic. 275 people die in Buryatia, and 350 people in Tuva, home to an Asian minority in the poorest region of Russia." In many cases, this is because those in the poorer regions are simply more likely to sign up to escape poverty. In Buryatia's regional capital, Ulan-Ude, the average monthly salary is a pitiful $500. In Moscow, it's closer to $1,200. Those fighting in Ukraine, though, are offered $2,500 a month, with bonuses available. As one interviewee the Times spoke with put it, "Money is the main reason people go to fight. The contracts being offered volunteers are crazy by our standards." But the disproportionate death rates among Russia's minorities aren't solely to do with how many rubles are sitting in people's bank accounts. There's some evidence it's part of a deliberate plan by the Kremlin to shield the white and wealthy from the impact of the war. We can see this by just looking back at the partial mobilization in the fall of 2022. While that generated chaos across Russia, the impacts were felt much more strongly in minority regions. The Diplomat spoke to a leading activist from Kalmykia who complained bitterly that, quote, "We see the disproportionality with a naked eye. From our ethnic minority regions, we had 3-4 times more men taken than from Slavic regions." End quote. Given that higher rates of mobilized men have died than any other group except prisoners, you can see how higher mobilization rates might lead to high death tolls. Back in the winter of 2022, a community leader from the 100,000-strong population of Nogais warned that 2 more waves of mobilization would be enough to make his people disappear completely. So yeah, maybe there's a reason the wealthier residents in Moscow are able to carry on like the war isn't even happening. It's not their friends, it's not their family, it's not their community that's being fed into the meat grinder, not their peers who are dying by the tens of thousands to help fulfill one aging autocrat's pathetic dreams of empire. So as we end this video then, it's hopefully having gained some insight into the true losses of Russia's forces, into the sorts of people who are dying every single day to carry out Putin's plans. And we'll be honest, we didn't expect, going into this video, to feel much sympathy to them. Awful as it is to say out loud, every one of those deaths represents a soldier no longer able to brutalize Ukraine, no longer taking part in a war designed to exterminate Ukraine's people and culture. And yet, we have to admit, there's something sadly touching about these vast numbers, about realizing that most of those dying are mobilized young men or minorities from poor regions who are desperately in need of money. Young men, in other words, who shouldn't even be in Ukraine, who would otherwise be alive and well. starting families, going hunting with friends, or taking care of their parents, had Vladimir Putin not launched his insane war. Now, it's customary to say that Putin has on his hands the blood of tens of thousands of innocent Ukrainians. To that we should add the blood of every single Russian soldier who didn't want to fight, or had no other choice. He may like to think of himself as a father to his people, but as this video has hopefully shown, the man in the Kremlin is nothing more than a parasite, a pale vampire sucking life from a generation of Russians in a pointless and horrific conflict. We can only pray that someday soon he pays for these crimes, that the count of Russian and Ukrainian war dead alike ends with just one more name added to it, the name of the monster behind all this needless suffering.